From the European Parliament here in Brussels, this is Raw Politics. Thank you for joining us tonight, and this is what we have coming up for you. Hitting the road. Guy Verhofstadt's not-so-subtle message to Viktor Orbán and his EU party. Making the pitch. Wannabe Commission presidents get personal in some earnest campaign videos. Question of trust. Justice Chief Vera Jourova calls for social media regulation to protect democracy. Europe Army. French President Emmanuel Macron calls for an EU military force. And look who's cooking. Former Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams and his negotiators' cookbook. Right, it's time to meet our panel for tonight. We begin with Darren McCaffrey, our political editor at Euronews. Darren, which of these stories do you like?
Well, I was there at the Guy Verhofstadt event just outside the Parliament earlier on today. We're starting to see the election campaign, even though we're more than 6 months out, really starting to ramp up. Yes, a message on Viktor Orbán, but ultimately an attack, I think, on the EPP.
Indeed. All right. Joining us tonight as well is Laura Shield. She's the director of Red Thread Communications and specializes in messaging training for senior politicians in Europe. Laura, which of these stories are you watching?
Well, unsurprisingly, I'm going to say it's the campaign videos that we've seen from Alexander Stubb and Manfred Weber, because I think these are just the opening shots in this very difficult communications political environment that we're going to see in the weeks and months to come.
Difficult, but really interesting, isn't it? All right. And also joining us is Seb Dance. He's a British MEP from the Labour Party and belongs to the group of Socialists and Democrats. Seb, which of these stories do you like?
I'm really interested in this army idea. I mean, whether or not it's the solution to the geopolitical problems Europe faces is perhaps a bigger question. But the fact is, very few people are talking about it, the geopolitical situation we find ourselves in. And it's refreshing, I think, to see the French president at least addressing it.
Right. Well, we'll have a lot more.
Can I say, Tessa, that
yes.
we all wanted to talk about the Gerry Adams video.
Of course.
And it's the most extraordinary thing. So we're all
we
very
will certainly
keen to
be talking about that. I mean, there are lots of stories we'll be covering tonight on Raw Politics. Let's begin with our top story. One of Europe's most prominent Liberal MEPs, Guy Verhofstadt. Well, he unveiled his new message just outside Parliament today. And Viktor Orbán is destroying Europe. That is the latest offensive in a PR battle between Hungary's Prime Minister, his Fidesz party, and EU liberal leaders. Now, the Hungarian government has itself been releasing videos on social media for months now, and these are certainly more subtle ways of going about this, of course. We're looking at these videos. Look at that. All right, well, looking at that, I mean, that's certainly one way of communicating, isn't it?
Yes, it certainly is. I mean, I think one of the things to remember when it comes to Guy Verhofstadt is that he is actually one of the few politicians who manages to cut through the Brussels bubble and has brand recognition in the wider context of Europe. So in that sense, it's certainly an innovative and it's quite compelling in that it builds on his brand. That said, Guy Verhofstadt is what we would call a Marmite politician in the UK. Marmite famously is a breakfast spread that people eat. Now they love it or they hate it. And it's the same.
For example.
You hate it.
You think it's delicious. You think
exactly.
It's good.
But Verhofstadt, much like Nigel Farage, Seb's best friend, is a Marmite politician, which means that it's going to work very well with the people who like him and think he's great. With the people who don't, it's just more of the same.
Yeah, what do you think, Seb? You kind of like it?
No, I completely agree. I think Verhofstadt is one of the few MEPs. I say this as an MEP who manages to cut through a range of audiences.
I wasn't talking about it.
I know you were, and I don't take it personally. But the truth is that very, very few people do make it on a national scene, and Guy is one of those people. So yeah, I agree. Your Marmite analysis is spot on.
I mean, this is really not a subtle way of going about things. Darren, you saw this for real. Was it convincing?
Well, no, I mean, he clearly feels quite passionate about it. He has been one of the strongest voices against Viktor Orbán in Parliament. That is undoubtedly true. Also, he is the leader of the ALD group. We're coming up to an election campaign. The EPP is meeting in Helsinki tomorrow. This was as much an attack on them as it was on Viktor Orbán. But as you say, I caught up with him earlier on when he was launching that campaign outside Parliament. And he started really by launching into Viktor Orbán. Let's have a listen.
Far too long what we have seen is Mr. Orbán very aggressively attacking liberal democracies. He called it illiberalism. He wants to create an illiberal state. And Europeans do nothing at all. Don't react. Don't even say we're going to stop you. Well, it's time that we do that, and that's the reason for this truck in English and at the other side, but you're going to see it in a few moments in Hungarian.
Who is this campaign aimed at? Is it aimed at MEPs? Is it aimed at the Hungarian people? Because aren't you just kind of stoking up the
to the Hungarian people? That's the reason why, if you have a minute, you're going to see at the other side the clear slogan also in Hungarian. And at the other side, it's also a message to the people here in Brussels, because otherwise it's not necessary to have the car in Brussels, so that they take their responsibility, because they can take their responsibility. We have taken our responsibility with the European Parliament. We have voted for an Article 7. And since then, I don't talk about the Commission, I mainly talk about the European Council. Nothing is happening.
People have voted for Viktor Orbán as well, though.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that you have the majority, that you can do what you want. I respect the outcome of the elections in Hungary. I don't dispute them, the elections in Hungary. But that doesn't mean if you have a majority in a country that you can start to forbid NGOs to be active. That you can start to close down a university.
Probably he was not elected on that basis. Yeah, I don't remember.
But don't you risk stirring up the very tensions that you claim you want to quell down?
Until what is happening is that for too long now, the last 10 years, pro-Europeans have been silent about this. We are talking about the Stability and Growth Pact, and we are talking a lot about the single market, but we don't talk about what is the biggest threat for the moment in Europe, that is undermining the values and the principles of the European Union. And nobody does it. Well, we will do it.
And that's clearly, I think, Tessa, a message we're going to see over and over again during the campaign. You know, as European politics fragments and as we see the rise of populism, clearly, potentially along with Emmanuel Macron, you know, he wants to be the face of actually what Europe needs is more Europe,
I mean,
not less.
that truck, that billboard was just right outside Parliament here. And there's this element of shock and awe. I mean, this is, you know, one of our panelists actually tonight has had his own interesting experience with this shock and awe and political messaging. Let's take a look at Stubb's stunt at the European Parliament, Stubb, that went viral. Look at that. This, you were holding a sign saying he's lying to you while Nigel Farage was speaking. I mean, what was that about?
Well,
were you trying to shock and awe as well?
Well, some of the frustration that Guy Verhofstadt was just talking about, I felt acutely on that day. I mean, I have to say it was not planned, and it wasn't something that I had thought, oh, well, this is going to be noticed, or I had no idea who would spot it or whatever. I was sitting there and I was absolutely incandescent, frankly, with the stuff that Farage, I knew he was going to say because, of course, as leader of the EFDD, I knew he'd get his speaking time. And I had to do something. And I think what we've just heard in terms of Guy saying that pro-Europeans haven't defended the values of Europe over the last 10 years, I completely agree. I don't think we've been muscular enough about this.
But I think without realizing, is that a successful way of political messaging? You have a simple, provocative, strong message. I mean, you've worked on campaigns. Is that communications 101?
Well, I think a lot of it, it's about having simple, provocative messages. And I think if we broaden this out to a couple of the more recent campaigns, obviously there was the Trump election and, of course, before that, Brexit, Make America Great Again, Vote, Leave, Take Control. Those are both very simple and provocative, but they were also great stories. Now, you can get into the substance behind it and whether or not the claims that were made were true. But I think that the simple, provocative messages work. But I also think it depends on who is delivering them.
Exactly.
And I think that Verhofstadt delivering messages in Hungary could be potentially very, very difficult and could play straight into Viktor Orbán's hands as well in terms of foreign interference.
Is that what's happening now? Because, okay, we just saw Nigel Farage, you have Viktor Orbán, certainly personalities, and that's what Guy Verhofstadt is trying to do. Is it now becoming, rather than policy, it's just personality versus personality?
I wish it would come a bit more personality in Europe. I don't think it is. That makes me sound incredibly superficial. No, I don't think we're there yet.
Okay.
To be frank, I think it's a very, very difficult climate, and I think people are trying anything because nobody really knows what the rules are anymore.
And to follow on Laura's point, is it playing into Viktor Orbán's hands?
I think that's a real possibility. As I say, though, I don't think this is necessarily just an attack on Viktor Orbán. This is about applying political pressure, hence why he was outside the European Parliament. But yeah, clearly, Viktor Orbán is popular in Hungary. I don't think anyone can doubt that. And, you know, is someone who stands for everything that Viktor Orbán doesn't stand for. Is that message going to resonate? Is it going to turn people? Is it going to be effective in Hungary?
Exactly.
I suspect no.
I think it also depends on where he's taking his billboard truck to. If he's taking it to Budapest, he's probably speaking to a pretty converted audience. You know, Orbán is not popular in Budapest. If Verhofstadt was really going to make this interesting, he would take his truck out into the middle of rural Hungary and have a conversation with some of the farming communities there. Now, that would be much more interesting, real conversation, but probably potentially a lot more risky.
I think part of this might be, though, demonstrating that you have support. So if you go to a place like Budapest, you have, if you like, the backing of other people in the European Union for your campaign for civil society in Hungary. I think that is an important message.
You're absolutely right, but then does it feed back into the Orbán and in fact what you see across the board in Europe with populists of the liberal elite? You know, he goes to Budapest, he talks to his own audience, the comparatively well-off, the politically engaged.
The constant problem is that for the people who argue that the solution to Europe's problems is more Europe, it's not in vogue at the moment. It's not having much traction with voters. And that is ultimately Guy Verhofstadt's big problem.
Yeah, well, speaking of political messaging and campaigning and knowing who your target audience is, well, our next story is still and also about political messaging. Manfred Weber and Alexander Stubb are competing to be the EPP's candidate for Commission President, and they're making their pitches in new campaign videos.
My village is Wildenberg, a small village in Lower Bavaria, and there I know everybody who is living in this small village. I was starting my activities in the youth organization of the Catholic Church and also the youth organization of the CSU, my party in Bavaria. There I experienced what it means to stand for an idea, to argue for an idea, and to fight for an idea. I was a guitar player in a band. I stood in the first row of the band, and that was for me an interesting experience. To be connected to people, to listen to them, to look in the eyes of the people, and to get an idea what they want to have next.
We're not a movie with written lines. Still we're chasing the perfect pretty life. Where are you going? What you trying to find? Like it's greener on the other side. It's like we're stressing out to find some peace of mind. It's a story of our time. In this heartbreak century, we're not a movie.
I can say there's a lot of reaction here as those videos were playing.
The music is the best bit of that Alex Stubb video.
This is what you do for a living.
No, this is not what I do.
I mean campaign videos. So yeah, the message and
okay. So look, the thing that we to just take a step back when we talk about the Spitzenkandidat process, what we're talking about is the person who ends up being the head of the European Commission based on which party gets the most, or which bloc gets the most votes in the European elections. So it's a weird mishmash of voting across the board in Europe for one person, and it's not actually a presidential contest. But with
and they ultimately may not end up getting
and they ultimately
position.
may not end it. But with that in mind, of course, you have to do a personality-based campaign. And what I would say from this, and certainly in relation to Alexander Stubb's video, is no personality comes through whatsoever. He is literally voiceless in his video. He doesn't speak, which I think is a real shame because I like Stubb. I think he's actually quite dry and quirky, but he doesn't speak. The video is a sort of composite of messages that I'm not sure what we're meant to take away, which is potentially, oh, we're better when we're together, even if we fight. Next generation of Europe, and yet at the same time, what do we see? Stock shots of Stubb getting out of a car, shaking hands with men in grey suits in Brussels, looking a bit lost at a press conference. I think he's meant to look soulful.
I mean, is the point here to say I'm one of the ordinary people? I'm one of you. Is that the point? I don't know. What do you reading from?
I mean, certainly from Weber's video, that is most definitely the message he wants to put across. It's not the image that most of us have of Weber, that he's a man of the people. So this is giving another perspective. But of course, we have to remember that these videos are for the EPP. They are for the EPP who are deciding who between them they will choose as their Spitzenkandidat. What you would like to see going further, of course, is an appeal to a team that the Spitzenkandidat from whichever political group it is, the team that they can bring forward with them. Because I think, as Laura said, it's virtually impossible to have that personality sell at a European level. So that the emphasis after the Spitzenkandidat is chosen has to be on what the team looks like.
The strange thing is, from the outset, if you would have asked me, I would have argued that Alex Stubb's video would have been so much more impressive. He is much more media savvy than Manfred Weber has been. And actually, watching those videos, it's the complete reverse.
Right.
Interestingly, it is what Manfred Weber needed to do, because people don't really know who he is. They don't know anything about him. And this is an attempt to try and sell him as a person. It's a little bit old-fashioned, given the political world in which we're in at the moment. However, I think it's important. Alex Stubb's attempt was, unbelievably bad.
Well,
it was engaging in no level. You got no sense of who he was. He's a little bit more familiar.
Well, I was also going to say, what it comes down to is who is this ultimately for? And when you look at Manfred Weber's video, his whole story, which is the who am I story, and they all have to do that, and I was actually quite surprised that he did, but it's the who am I story, and it's targeted at that small C conservative audience. Who am I? Where do I come from? I come from Bavaria, which has been the flashpoint for so much of Europe. Words like safety, comfort, identity, all of these things are massively playing into this video. It's designed to reassure and comfort. Hell, you even have him running in the woods, which is a symbol of identity in German.
But is this the kind of communication that European politicians should be engaging in fact, moving forward?
I think in terms of explaining the person behind the policymaker, if you like, then yeah, absolutely.
Would you like to communicate who you are when you're campaigning?
I try to.
But I think it's actually quite a bold move on the part of Weber, because this is a 2-minute video and he doesn't actually mention the EU and European politics until about 1 minute 20 in. So he's very much doing the play on who he is and the identity.
Which I think which is important, because
Alex Stubb does have more of that.
He has got some form of identity, because he was a former prime minister. Manfred Weber doesn't. And if he keeps making videos like this, he might actually make some
balance.
This isn't novel. Sorry, just to finish. This isn't new. Everybody knows that Angela Merkel was the chemist's daughter of a vicar in the east of Germany. Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, son of a Pakistani immigrant bus driver. Everybody has this story of where they're coming from. I think it's brilliant that they're bringing this now into European political campaigning, but of course it can't be the only thing.
Speaking of image and personal stories, what's happening behind the scenes, there is a kind of story and image that you wouldn't want to see, especially on social media. Let's bring up this picture and see if our guests can tell who it is.
Is it you, Darren?
It is
certainly
actually Italy's Matteo Salvini. His girlfriend broke up with him on social media. This is what's written in Italian.
It would be sweet if you weren't breaking up with someone.
Well, let me just read what's written. It says, "It's not what we have given each other that I will miss, but what we still had to give each other, with immense respect for the true love that there was. Thank you, Matteo." So that was what was written.
It's sweet, isn't it?
You think it's sweet?
Yeah, it's sweet. I've got no time for Salvini.
But is it dirty politics here that we are starting to see? Or?
Well, did he post it with her permission, or did she? I have to say, I don't know the story.
They broke up, huh? They broke up.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think she just posted it to say that this was her attempt to say we've now broken up.
Okay. Yeah.
Which I don't think is necessarily. It's not nice to do these things in public, is it really?
It's the interesting choice of very intimate shots, isn't it?
Yes.
I don't know. I think the risk that it runs is that once you start putting pictures out like that, it's very difficult to take them back. So I wouldn't call it dirty politics. It's just that you're basically playing with the image. I wouldn't even call it that. I think you're playing with your personal life, which is very risky.
And I think once you let people in,
it's difficult to get them out.
But the message here, isn't it? There's no acrimony.
Between the two, because I think he did reply in the end. So.
Yeah. That's.
So for you, it's positive.
It's a nice change to some of the kind of breakup stories you see.
Or the trolling that you get
I guess
online.
we don't often see politicians in images like this.
Can we make it clear that it's definitely not me?
All right, well, we have a lot more coming up on Raw Politics. In the name of democracy, European Justice Chief Vera Jourova calls for more tech transparency during election campaigns. Plus, he calls it the best-kept secrets of the Irish peace process. Former Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams in a See It to Believe It video promoting his new cookbook. Don't go away. Back to Raw Politics. Now, a tech summit in Portugal is underway, and the kind of web we want for the future is on the cards. One of big tech's most formidable adversaries, Justice Commissioner Vera Jourova, delivered a speech calling for tighter regulation of the cyber world. Here's what she had to say.
It is time to stop foreign actors with the specific aim to disrupt our elections and spread mistrust of our democratic institutions. Europeans are worried that their elections are being rolled out in an unfair manner. We need the transparency of online political advertising to be guaranteed. We need improving the protection of personal data in the electoral context. We need to protect elections from cyber attacks. and we need to improve national and European cooperation on potential threats to European Parliament elections.
Well, back with me is our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, and joining us for this panel is Eva Kaili, a Greek MEP from the Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, and Andrew Byrne, the Sunday Times EU correspondent. All right, we have Jourova speaking in that, and she's talking about technology, the state of technology. Is it killing democracy?
Well, I don't believe it's threatening democracy. It's too democratic at this point. We were not prepared for too much democracy, maybe. I think what we have to do is to have digital literacy to understand if our perception is being manipulated. This is the most important thing. And when we talk about fake news, I'm a bit scared because it actually means maybe ban content. And the Ministry of Truth is not something that we need. We need more options. We need to make sure that technology will provide us with the correct options and a news feed that it's going to be personalized, but it will not alter our perception of reality.
Is there such a thing as too much democracy? Go ahead.
Well, I don't know what we have now on the internet. I don't know if democracy is the best term for it. I think we're only scratching the surface of what's happening out there. I think last week Twitter revealed that it had deleted 10,000 bots in the US that were posing as Democrats, urging other Democrats not to vote. And then in May and June, I think there were something like 70 million fake accounts on Twitter taken down alone. So we're only, I think, scratching the surface of what's going on. And you've got to ask, by the time we've discovered there's a fake account on Twitter or whatever platform takes it down, how many more fake accounts have been set up to take their place? So I think we need a lot more detail. I think Eva's right that we can't have a sort of a Ministry of Truth approach, but I think we're going to have to lean on these actors to be a lot more strict about policing fake content.
Actually, we spoke a lot more with Commissioner Vera Jourova at the Web Summit in Portugal. We asked her why the web needs regulation and how it can be kept free at the same time. Let's hear what she had to say.
We need better protection against the waves of disinformation and panicking messages and news which cause big hysteria and fear in the society. That's why we say in Europe, let's take all the necessary measures, preventive measures, but at the same time, censorship is not a good choice. Regulation which would kill free choice and free development of digital world would go to the detriment of our society. So speaking about smart regulation, only what's necessary and proportionate, I think it's the best choice we have. This is about protecting pluralism.
All right, she used words there like fake news, hysteria, fear. I mean, so is regulation the
in some ways,
those?
That's hysteria. I think it's to the point here where is it good that people have access to information and they have access to more information than they've ever had before? Yes, that's a good thing. Second of all, do we have to trust people that they're going to be able to work out what a bot is? And the thing is, people talk about these bots. How clever are these bots? Are they really able to convince people necessarily not to vote? I'm not entirely convinced they are.
We've had major newspapers quoting these bots in stories as real sources. So actually quite sophisticated people, although not all of us journalists are perfectly sophisticated, but many of us have been fooled by these bots. So I think doing nothing is hardly the right choice.
But I don't think it's necessarily good to be drawn through Twitter trying to get... and also, I think, we talk about Twitter a lot, for example. Not that many people actually use Twitter in the grand scheme of things.
True.
And I don't think it necessarily... But most of all, who judges the polarity?
Exactly.
Who decides what is fake news and what isn't? Even in Europe, does Viktor Orbán get to decide what fake news is, or does Emmanuel Macron? that's the crux of this.
Yeah, so
who gets to decide?
Eva, you were thinking of regulation, but can people trust governments and authorities to
because
regulate?
You don't know what a government wants, and you have to be lucky to have a good government to control that. That's why I said we should not have ministries of truth. What we have to do is to make sure we're going to provide options to citizens. So basically to give them the other side of the story and then the education for them to decide. And we're trying to provide them with scientific data and evidence-based information so they can have clarity and actually to respond immediately to something that becomes viral, because virality is the main problem. It doesn't actually have to be bots. If something becomes viral because it's isolated and some people try to help this become viral, we are lacking to respond very fast, and this is what we have to fix.
And obviously, we're talking about all of this in the context of elections coming up and election meddling. I mean, these are important issues to bring up at a time like this. Right. Well, the inventor of the web, he's also worried about the future of tech. Tim Berners-Lee, he's launching a campaign calling for a so-called contract for the web. He spoke to CNBC at the Web Summit in Lisbon. Let's take a look.
A lot of people are realizing that things are not the way they maybe could be on the web, and lots of people have to get together, hence the contract, to work. So governments, individuals, companies need to make sure, push the web in particular ways towards it being more truthful, more creative, more constructive, more democratic. But even though you might have these large silos, the silos shouldn't dominate your life. You should be able to move from one to the other. You should be able to operate with data from wherever it comes from.
Yeah, so Andrew, have we gone so far from the original purpose of the internet that we have to rein it back in and have a contract?
Well, I think, when the web was founded by, 29, 30 years ago, it made sense that this was a new liberal space where there wouldn't be government control and it could create new opportunities. But I think 30 years later, I think it's no longer acceptable to have the web used for promoting terrorist content, extremist content, to have levels of misinformation that is perhaps undermining the democratic basis of society. And I totally have the point. I'm not an advocate of censorship, but I think what we're witnessing now is the internet maturing, and regulation has to mature with it.
To what, Darren, you mentioned earlier, the fact that we raised the point of hysteria is in itself hysteria. Is the perception of election meddling, for instance, or interference itself dangerous? The idea that we think
yes, I think it
rigged.
is, and I think in some ways you could say it's damn ironic that you've got European leaders talking about foreign interventions and foreign influence in elections when Europe's been involved in that for many hundreds of years. I mean, even look at Russia, for example. Western governments are involved in Russia in funding pro-democracy movements. Now, whatever you might think that's a noble cause, and it may well be a noble cause, but to Russians that is election interference.
It's
that's exactly what
that's the difference, right?
Well,
between
I'm not entirely sure it is transparent
effort.
because we don't know who these groups are. All I'm suggesting is that I'm slightly uncomfortable because you look at China, you look at other Saudi Arabia, Iran, countries that do control the World Wide Web, and I'm not entirely sure that they're in a better position than we all are. Look, and when it comes to it, we look at Donald Trump, we look at Brexit. Are we really suggesting that it was the internet that swung those referendums and that election?
We are looking very closely at the midterm elections happening in the United States, and because Americans are heading to the polls today for those elections. Experts have warned that misleading information posted online is worse in this election than in 2016. Alex Morgan in the Cube has more on this. Alex.
Tessa, yes, 2016, of course, a presidential election. These are midterm elections. But just yesterday, Facebook put out this statement. They say, we are taking action. We've been really concerned to deal with law enforcement to make sure there's no election interference. And they say they've identified a number of accounts on their sites. They say early stages, 30 on Facebook that may have been involved in coordinated inauthentic behavior, and 85 on Instagram. Now, this is being presented as Facebook taking action, but these numbers are very, very small, it's fair to point out. Also, this statement just saying may have engaged in this kind of behavior. The Facebook accounts here are predominantly in Russian and in French, so a focus on foreign actors. But it seems this time around, the focus really should be on the scale of domestic junk news. At least that's according to the Oxford Internet Institute. They put out a report saying, in the lead up to this election, 25% of all the news being consumed in the United States is coming from domestic junk news sources. Junk news, not fake news. Let me break it down for you. I asked the researchers, why do you call it junk news, not fake news? They say fake news has been weaponized, especially in America. I mean, it's fair to say it is a political weapon now. Instead, they define junk news as sources publishing deliberately misleading, deceptive or incorrect information, particularly coming from ideologically extreme or hyper-partisan positions. They have a number of criteria. There's 5 criteria to meet. They say if it meets 3 of those, they classify it as junk news. And they conclude that this time around, junk news, 25% of the news being consumed is this junk news. Now, when it comes to classifying things like hyper-partisan, politically extreme, these are, of course, loaded terms. So I asked the internet researchers, I said, well, hang on a minute, how do you respond to the claims that what you're putting out here, effectively calling sites junk news, is different from people calling it the misleading mainstream media? This is what the report author had to say. Well, she said, we typically see sources from across the political spectrum sharing these junk news sources, saying they've worked up this criteria for 2 years, looking at Europe, Latin America and America. But they say here, in the United States, it does tend to be sources leaning towards the right that are accounting for the most of these junk news sources. But just a final thought for you, Tessa. In a conference call this morning, Department of Homeland Security saying, despite supposed misinformation campaigns, they haven't seen any specifically targeting voters today or the voting processes. So one thing to be concerned about, but we'll see, obviously, how this election goes.
Thank you for that, Alex and the Cube team. And we're speaking about messaging in times of elections, referendum, and specifically Brexit. Europe's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, he gave a speech, a message in Brussels last night, and he told us a story about a recent conversation he had with Nigel Farage. Take a look.
Dites-moi, Monsieur Farage, vous avez été en tête du combat du Brexit, vous avez gagné. Nous sommes en train de délivrer le Brexit, c'est l'objet de cette négociation. Est-ce que je peux vous demander comment, à la fin, après le Brexit, vous imaginez, comment vous voyez-vous les relations entre l'Union européenne et le Royaume-Uni? Et il m'a répondu ceci. Monsieur Barnier, après le Brexit, l'Union européenne n'existera plus.
Tongue-in-cheek there from Michel Barnier.
Yeah, Nigel Farage is always one of ambition, I suppose. You could put it that way. I think what is interesting is that speech last night. He again made it clear that, yeah, we're nearly there, but we're not there yet. And we are getting to the point now, or certainly in the next couple of weeks or so, where if there isn't a deal, we are going to start moving into no-deal territory. And it has to be said, that is not good news, obviously, for Britain and for the European Union. But it's not good news for Michel Barnier as well, because he spent 2 years trying to
not going to have the answer.
No, well, I'm not. No, he hasn't. But of course, sure. He's in charge of the negotiations.
Absolutely.
I mean, Nigel Farage, obviously he sort of predicted there would be no EU after Brexit, sure. It would fall apart. And I think, those who thought that Brexit would be the first domino to fall, I totally agree, a no-deal Brexit is bad for everyone, including Michel Barnier. But those who thought Brexit would be the domino falling of the EU collapsing, you look at the opinion polls around Europe, it seems to have surprisingly had the opposite approach. It's a response. It's galvanised support for EU membership.
It's the one issue that's united the rest of the European Union.
Isn't that ironic? Indeed. All right, after the break on Raw Politics, why French President Emmanuel Macron says Europe needs its own army. Don't go away. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, Europe needs an army to protect itself against Russia, China, and even the United States. That was the stark message delivered by France's Emmanuel Macron today. Since rising to the French presidency last year, he's been calling for greater defense coordination. But this is Emmanuel Macron's most explicit call for an EU army so far. Take a look at what he said in an interview with the French radio station Europe 1.
Nous devons nous protéger à l'égard de la Chine, de la Russie et même des États-Unis d'Amérique. Quand je vois le président Trump annoncer il y a quelques semaines le fait qu'il sorte d'un grand traité de désarmement qui avait été pris, je le rappelle, après la crise des euromissiles au milieu des années 80, qui avait frappé l'Europe. Qui en est la victime principale? L'Europe et sa sécurité. On ne protégera pas les Européens si on ne décide pas d'avoir une vraie armée européenne.
All right, well, I am back in the studio with our panel, Darren McCaffrey, Andrew Byrne, and Eva Kaili. All right, Eva, does Europe need an army?
Of course it does. We are at the borders of Europe, so Greece and Italy suffered the most from the migration and refugee crisis, and the threats we have also from a NATO ally like Turkey. I think it's something that if we want to deal with, we have to be together with the rest of Europe. And of course, for several countries, it's important for the borders close to Russia. So I think having a European army will actually make all these problems become European problems, because they are too heavy for Europe and for Greece and Italy themselves. And you saw the results with our elections.
Is that the right?
I mean, of course, Europe needs an army, but of course, Europe already has several armies, right? And it has a NATO alliance. I'm inclined to cast a cold, cynical eye on Macron's comments. You know, he is completely exhausted. It's reported his poll numbers have slumped, and so desperate times call for desperate kind of statements. This EU army call is a regular refrain of politicians. It allows you to look visionary,
or maybe they're testing the waters for a real actual army.
I don't know. It's been said so many times, and it never happens because European countries have found it so difficult thus far to cooperate. If you look at common security and defence policy, it's been among the most disappointing of areas of integration for federalists. And I think, you know, ultimately, you know, if you take one example, for instance, there was a lot of talk about the need for a common European external border guard to deal with the migration crisis. 3 years later, after the most poisonous political crises, where is this external border guard?
It's on its
just
way,
not going to happen.
apparently. Yeah, I mean, and that's the problem with Emmanuel Macron. It's lots of big vision stuff. Yeah. He keeps talking about what Europe needs is more Europe. He wants to see greater integration in the Eurozone. He wants to see a European army.
Look, he's not alone in that.
Well, no, but come on, 18 months in, there's very little evidence he's actually achieved any of this. A European army has been talked about for an awful long time. And yes, in the context of Donald Trump in the White House and seemingly the undermining of NATO, it might seem like a good idea. But are we realistically going to get there anytime soon?
Actually, we are, and somebody has to be bold about it. So I like that he talked about it. It was not the case. We didn't even talk about that.
I'll just bring in, because Emmanuel Macron, he's not alone, as I was saying, in this idea and pushing it forward. You agree with him, in fact. Well, Macron appears to have a powerful ally in his vision for this European defense. We have German Chancellor Angela Merkel. And it was the election of Donald Trump, in fact, which led her to say it is no longer such that the United States simply protects us, but Europe must take its destiny in its own hands. That's the task of the future. All right. I do want to point out.
We have committed 13 billion for this is a proposal of the Commission for a European Defence Fund. So we're actually doing something about it.
You could dig out quotes from Gerhard Schroeder, from Jacques Chirac, from any number of former German chancellors or French presidents calling for EU armies, and it just doesn't happen for good reason.
But we didn't have Trump and Brexit. Now we do, and now we have also Turkey, and I think we have to get our things together.
But I think I just want to point out the difference in what Merkel wants. She wants a defence army, but Macron wants an army that actually goes abroad. So there's a difference in then protecting yourself.
There have been military excursions where actually soldiers have, represented the European flag. No, I'm not suggesting they're very big.
Missions,
they are small missions. But ultimately, Andrew's right. This has been talked about for a long time. I do not see that Emmanuel Macron saying it on the anniversary of the centenary of the First World War. It's a political kind of thing to roll out every so often. It's expedient at the moment. Are we going to get there? I don't think so.
First, we have to start talking about it. So I like that the conversation started, and it started actually with a lot of funding.
Who's going to pay for it?
But if the funding is there, because the proposal seems it's going to pass, and the MFF is going to be drawn now before the end of this mandate, this means we have headquarters here. We're starting to do something about it.
You've got billions less because Britain's leaving. The demands on the European budget have never been greater.
Exactly.
I cannot imagine
25% of the defence of the possibility of Europe to defend itself leaves with UK, which means we have to do something about it.
No, because it's still part of NATO. It's still part of NATO.
But Turkey is there too.
As you were saying that Europe's more united after with Brexit happening.
It's moving faster. We are moving faster.
Very briefly, yes.
Emmanuel Macron needs a poll boost. He needs to revive his figures ahead of the elections, and this is just another
You're really skeptical about the army.
The greatest argument for it happening is Britain leaving, because it's been the biggest opponent of it happening.
On that note, well, let's go to today's raw moment. You may think you know everything there is to know about the road to peace in Northern Ireland, but according to the former Sinn Féin leader, there's one thing you don't know, and that's what they ate.
My name's Jerry Adams. I used to be elector on Sinn Féin, and I'm here to tell you about one of the best kept secrets of the Irish peace process. Lord of my August Bush, Sin Galanta, it got you lump. When I was putting this book together, there were numbers of suggestions for what we would call it. Long quiche, the peas process, But we settled for your Cogarachta, the negotiators' cookbook.
We've got two Irishmen in the panel. Were you cringing or smiling or what?
When I was growing up, this man used to, was a terrifying force. Someone who used to, was linked to hardline republicanism. And look at him now. I don't know, what is it about ex-politicians getting involved in strange...
Or painting or
Well, I mean, he has got a point, Republicans needed to be fed, and apparently they were very good at feeding it.
He managed to be on the news, right?
Yeah,
So-
I mean, he's the best example, I think, that you can always find a new start in life. I mean, he's also known for posting pictures of himself with his teddy bear in the internet, on Twitter.
So is it not entirely out of character?
Naked with his dogs.
It's not.
Yeah, hidden
I
depths.
didn't know that.
My favourite name for the book, though, was Pizza in Our Time.
Aha. Well, that's a nice
quite
name.
good, isn't it?
Why not? All right. Well, thank you, guys. And
You should
thank
watch the whole video, though. It's very funny.
It is. And thank you, everyone, for watching us tonight. We'd like to hear what you're talking about. I'm on Twitter at Tessa Ercilia, or you can follow us at Euronews and use the hashtag WorldPolitics. Have a good evening. See you again.